Until now, whenever African leaders accused the United Nations of being involved in terrorist activities in Africa, the international community paid little attention. It was difficult to believe that an organization established to prevent conflicts would engage in terrorism. However, it is possible that the United Nations has taken advantage of this sentiment to carry out covert and questionable activities in Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo serves as a prime example, with the United Nations conducting numerous missions and operations that seemingly serve Western interests. Yet, these operations have hidden motives, as revealed by Yoweri Museveni, the Ugandan president and former military officer, who possesses extensive knowledge of the United Nations. Museveni recently made a categorical statement claiming that the United Nations is involved in something in Congo that would surprise many. In the Western world, when a former government official exposes their government, their words carry weight, especially if their arguments are valid. However, when African leaders convey their displeasure and expose the hypocrisy of Western countries, they are often ignored. But this time, they will be heard. Most recently, President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda accused the United Nations of sustaining terrorism in the Democratic Republic of Congo and contributing to chaos in several Sahel countries. He used strong language like the conservation of terrorism by the United Nations peacekeeping missions, which were ironically meant to combat terrorism in the first place. According to Museveni, in Africa, some actors who attempt to act as global policemen either create or perpetuate terrorism. The unrest in Libya and Sahel countries such as Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria, and Chad, among others, has been caused by some of these actors. The United Nations has been involved in a project to sustain terrorism in eastern Congo for the past 20 years, controlled by specific actors through undemocratic structures like the Security Council. Yoweri Museveni further argued that it is astonishing how the United Nations can exert excessive pressure, exploit resources from Congo, and occasionally harm Congolese citizens, while also targeting Ugandans. These actions undermine the economic prospects of the people in the Great Lakes region. Museveni expressed his intention to collaborate with the Congolese government, leveraging the strength of Uganda's security system. He highlighted the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, a Ugandan rebel group entrenched in the volatile jungles of eastern Congo for years, which has been widely blamed for the attacks. Museveni conveyed his accusation to UN investigators, asserting that the United Nations bears responsibility for sustaining terrorism in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The question remains, who is behind the ADF, and how does this rebel group continue to exist despite facing troops from around the world, including UN peacekeepers? It seems implausible, unless the UN peacekeepers have been instructed to feign their fight against these terrorists, while allowing them to regroup and grow again. The recent attack was deemed by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres as the most severe on the world body in recent history. The United Nations Organization Stabilisation Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO, established in 2010, is the largest peacekeeping mission globally. However, it has faced challenges in neutralizing various rebel and militia factions in eastern Congo, drawing criticism from Museveni. In response to the ADF attack, Uganda conducted air and artillery strikes on the group's camps a few days later. The Ugandan government cited intelligence indicating hostile actions planned by the rebels against Uganda. Uganda, with its involvement in the lawless eastern Congo in the past, is determined to prevent the ADF from re-entering its oil-rich western region. Uganda plans to start extracting crude oil in its western region by 2020. While the international community debates the effectiveness of UN peacekeepers, there seems to be little consideration for the opinions of the Congolese people themselves. William Yukani, a Congolese activist born in 1999, witnessed the arrival of UN troops wearing blue helmets and operating white tanks in his country at a very young age. He finds it paradoxical that tanks, often associated with peace, can advocate for peace while carrying weapons and resorting to violence. Yoweri criticizes the UN troops, citing the death of his mother in 2019 at the hands of an Islamist militia known as the Allied Democratic Forces. The insecurity in his village, located in the eastern Beni territory, hampers his access to his family's fields. Museveni. He expresses that for almost 25 years, the mission's mandate has been continuously renewed, but instead of improving the situation, it has only worsened. Yoweri is one among the many protesters in eastern DRC who are demonstrating against the UN mission known as MONUSCO, which is one of the largest and most expensive peace operations in the world. These protests have recently turned violent, with peacekeepers shooting civilians, resulting in 36 deaths, including 4 peacekeepers. Yoweri shares the emotional toll he experiences when he witnesses MONUSCO, a mission intended to protect civilians, firing at them. Jean-Pierre Kasara-Mageti, a 28-year-old activist from the civil society youth group Lucha, emphasizes the need for the UN to ensure accountability for peacekeepers who kill civilians and provide compensation to the families of the victims. Prior to the protests, MONUSCO had planned to withdraw by 2024, contingent upon improvements in security in the DRC. However, the recent surge of anger has led the Congolese government to reconsider this plan. While MONUSCO's initial years in the DRC saw the signing of a power-sharing agreement that ended the devastating wars of the 1990s and early 2000s, conflict fronts multiplied later, resulting in over 100 armed groups and more than 5 million displaced people. Recent polls indicate that a majority in North Kivu and the neighboring Ituri province want the mission's 12,000 troops to leave immediately. In response, the Congolese government has authorized other foreign military interventions to combat armed groups, including a potential force from the East African Community, a regional bloc that the DRC joined in March. However, protesters, mindful of the destructive impact of colonial rule and ongoing regional interference, exercise caution regarding additional external involvement. They argue that an East African Community force would likely involve the same national troop contingents that already make up a significant part of MONUSCO. Currently, UN peacekeeping missions in Africa face substantial challenges in establishing peace and stability, encountering opposition from certain African nations advocating for their withdrawal. Missions in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Mali, and the Central African Republic struggle to achieve their objectives. These forces operate under strict guidelines, but face difficulties in ensuring overall security, stabilizing volatile situations, and effectively protecting civilians. Some argue that perhaps the UN troops were never given the mission to eliminate terrorists from the region in the first place. Adib Sani, the executive director for the JEDEC Center for Human Security and Peacebuilding, highlights that UN missions consistently fall short in addressing the persistent cycle of violence in these countries. Deviating from their initial purpose, they fail to bring about significant improvements in the security situation. Mali serves as an example where the security situation has not shown improvement, and the mission appears powerless in the face of escalating violence. Malian citizens have turned against the UN peacekeeping mission, accusing the forces of exacerbating tensions. Mali's foreign minister officially called for the UN to withdraw its forces, stating that the mission is becoming part of the problem by fueling intercommunal tensions. When allegations of abuses by UN troops go uninvestigated and perpetrators remain unpunished, the effectiveness of the UN mission becomes questionable. Despite these challenges, Mohamed Anorak from the University of Letters and Human Sciences of Bamako emphasizes the crucial roles played by the UN missions. He expresses concern about the potential consequences if the missions fail or exit, as it could lead to more significant issues in the host countries. Amarat highlights that MINUSMA, for example, acts as a buffer between Malian authorities and the rest of the territory, and its departure would require filling the void it leaves behind. It's important to note that the UN missions are not considered complete failures. They have shown effectiveness to some extent and can provide valid justifications and performance when asked to leave. Additionally, their mission is not to completely eradicate all terrorists from African countries indefinitely. This is because if they were to do so, there would be no reason for them to continue their presence. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, emphasizes that terrorism knows no bounds in terms of age, culture, religion, nationality, or region. He expresses particular concern about the situation in Africa, where despair, poverty, hunger, lack of basic services, unemployment, and unconstitutional changes in government create fertile ground for the expansion of terrorist groups across the continent. The online world further amplifies the global spread of violent ideologies. However, it is widely understood that the world expects the United Nations to solve this problem. Despite having troops deployed worldwide, when UN peacekeeping missions fail, it explicitly shows that the United Nations never intended for the missions to succeed. If they truly desired success, they could manage it, as demonstrated by the United Nations operation in the Congo, launched in response to the Congo crisis in 1960. The mission was sent to Congo because the country fell into chaos after gaining independence from Belgium. Disorder prompted Belgium to intervene under the pretext of restoring order and protecting Belgian nationals. In response to the Congolese government's plea for assistance, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 143 on July 14, 1960. This resolution called for the withdrawal of Belgian troops and authorized the Secretary General to provide military aid to the Congolese government. The first UN troops, primarily from African and Asian states, arrived in the Congo the following day. As conditions deteriorated, including the uprising in Katanga, the assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, the collapse of the central government, and the involvement of foreign mercenaries, the initial mandate of the UN mission expanded. It expanded to protect the Congo's territorial integrity and political independence, prevent an impending civil war, and ensure the removal of unauthorized foreign armed forces. During its peak, the United Nations operation in the Congo, UNUC, had nearly 20,000 military personnel from over 24 countries. Key leadership roles were held by India, Ireland, and Sweden. From September 1961 to December 1962, UNUC transitioned from a peacekeeping mission to a military force engaging in clashes and offensives against secessionist and mercenary forces. After Katanga's reintegration in February 1963, UNUC gradually phased out, accompanied by increased civilian aid. This marked one of the most extensive UN assistance efforts at that time, and UN personnel completed their withdrawal on June 30, 1964. Although this mission had its shortcomings, it demonstrated the potential of what the United Nations could achieve with pure intentions. However, the current situation is quite different. The United Nations had outlined 4 key objectives for the operation in the Congo: to restore law and order, prevent intervention from other nations, contribute to the country's economic development, and restore stability. However, the UN faced criticism during its involvement in the Congolese crisis, particularly regarding the handling of events like Lumumba's death and the secession in Katanga. Criticism intensified following Lumumba's death, with many arguing that the UN should have provided better protection for the Prime Minister. Notably, a significant protest in New York saw African American demonstrators entering the UN building, causing disruptions in the General Assembly. The UN's office in Belgium was also targeted. Lumumba's murder revealed that despite the ostensibly working UN mission, it was protecting Western interests. How could a sitting prime minister be assassinated when UN troops were responsible for security? It seems unlikely that the UN troops were unaware of the situation before the assassination took place. Recent evidence suggests that the United States was directly involved in Lumumba's assassination, implying that the UN mission would have inevitably played a role in facilitating it. The USR also condemned the UN's involvement. On December 23, 1960, Kofi addressed the UN General Assembly, highlighting the operation's politically controversial direction. There were accusations of responsibility for Lumumba's death, favoritism toward Lumumba's political opponents, and initial reluctance to address the situation in Katanga. In 1999, the United Nations Organization Stabilisation Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO, was established. Military personnel from various nations, including Bangladesh, Brazil, China, France, India, and the United States, contributed to MONUSCO. Additionally, police personnel from countries like Benin, Brazil, France, Jordan, and others were involved in the peacekeeping efforts. A substantial amount of funding, approximately $8 to $74 billion, was allocated to support MONUSCO from 1999 to 2010. However, MONUSCO faced allegations of wrongdoing. In 2007 and 2008, the BBC reported that MONUSCO peacekeepers stationed in Mongwalu were involved in a gold-for-guns trading arrangement with leaders of the Nationalist and Integrationist Front militia. Furthermore, instances of sexual misconduct by UN peacekeeping forces in the Congo were acknowledged by the UN itself in a letter dated March 24, 2005, from the Secretary General to the President of the General Assembly. After over 24 years, the UN mission in Congo seems to have failed to meet its initially decided objectives. In response, Congo requested MONUSCO to leave the country. The United Nations Security Council unanimously approved the initiation of the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers from Congo before the end of the year. This decision aligns with the conflict-ridden country's preparations for its upcoming presidential election. The resolution endorsed by the UN's most influential body mandates a gradual, responsible, and sustainable withdrawal of the peacekeeping mission known as MONUSCO. The withdrawal will begin in South Kivu, Eastern Congo, with a phased transfer of responsibilities to the Congolese government. President Felix Tshisekedi of Congo, who is running for re-election against approximately 20 candidates, advocated for an accelerated withdrawal of the 15,000 peacekeepers in a speech to the UN General Assembly in September. He emphasized the importance of a responsible and sustainable phased withdrawal. On November 24, Congo's foreign minister and the top UN official in Congo signed agreements to conclude the presence of UN peacekeepers after over 2 decades in the Central African nation. The Security Council's resolution outlines that the withdrawal from South Kivu should conclude by the end of April 2024. The Council expresses readiness to consider additional withdrawals based on progress in the UN disengagement plan and the situation on the ground. The mandate for MONUSCO has been extended until December 20, 2024, with a troop ceiling of 13,500 military personnel, 660 military observers and staff officers, and 1,300 international police. From July 1, 2024, these numbers will be reduced to 11,500 military personnel, 600 military observers and staff officers, and 1,300 international police. The resolution strongly condemns all armed groups operating in Congo and demands an immediate cessation of violent and destabilizing activities, as well as the illegal exploitation and trafficking of the country's natural resources. It specifically targets conflict minerals such as tin, tantalum, tungsten, gold, diamonds, cobalt, and coltan, along with cocoa, charcoal, timber, and wildlife, which are exploited by armed groups and their supporting criminal networks. There are concerns that the UN's peacekeeping missions in Africa may not effectively address terrorism. Some argue that these missions are deliberately designed to perpetuate insecurity and conflict, ensuring a continual presence of UN troops in the region. This deliberate inefficacy is believed to serve the interests of Western nations, allowing them to secure and safeguard their strategic concerns on the African continent. By allowing terrorism to persist, the need for UN peacekeeping forces remains constant, maintaining a perpetual state of conflict that serves the interests of Western nations. The Ugandan president has expressed doubts about the genuine intentions of UN missions, suggesting that African leaders should consider removing UN peacekeeping missions from their countries, as seen in Mali and Congo. Exposing the alleged terrorist activities led by the UN to the world requires a platform for open dialogue and investigation. It is important to gather evidence, share information, and engage in international discussions to shed light on these concerns and ensure transparency in UN-led operations.